When people first hear the story of Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa, they often react the same way. They hear the outline, and it sounds almost unreal. A Mexican farm worker becomes a brain surgeon. A young man who once worked in the fields ends up standing over one of the most difficult diseases in all of medicine. A man who began far from the halls of elite universities eventually earns the respect of some of the most demanding institutions in the world. It sounds like the kind of story that gets simplified into a headline. But if you only remember the headline, you miss the weight of the journey. You miss the years that made it possible. You miss the private discipline that no one saw. And you miss the fact that this was never a fairy tale about instant success. It was a long climb through exhaustion, uncertainty, and the kind of pressure that either breaks a person or forges them into someone stronger. That is why the title sticks. The Mexican farm worker who became Dr. Q. It sounds sharp, dramatic, even cinematic, but the truth underneath it is more human than heroic. Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa did not arrive in medicine because the road was easy. He arrived there because he kept moving while other people were busy deciding where he belonged. He crossed into the United States as a young man. He took work in the fields of California. He lived close to the edge of scarcity, where every day had to be earned before it could be lived. And from that place, he started building a future that nobody had handed him. There is something powerful about that kind of beginning because it strips the story down to its real materials. No inherited path, no guarantee, no comfortable assumption that the next door would open just because he knocked. Instead, there was labor. There was the sun over the fields. There was the repetition of work that left little energy for anything else. There was the reality of being seen, at least at first, as a worker and not a future doctor. And there was the quiet decision, repeated over and over again, that he would not let that first description become the final one. The early part of his life matters because it explains the rest. It explains the endurance. It explains why the later achievements do not feel like a sudden transformation, but like the visible surface of something that had been forming for years. He had to learn English. He had to build education from the ground up. He earned a GED. He pushed himself toward a life that was completely disconnected from the one people around him might have expected. And every step forward was a test, not just of intelligence, but of patience, humility, and stamina. There is a kind of determination that appears only when failure would be easier than continuing. Alfredo's story is full of that kind of determination. The fields were not romantic, they were not symbolic in the abstract sense. They were real work, physical work, the kind that makes time feel thick. And yet those years became a training ground of another sort. They taught him what effort means when the reward is uncertain. They taught him how to keep going without applause. They taught him that dignity does not depend on the job title attached to a person's name. That may be one of the most important truths in this entire story, because once he entered medicine, he carried that understanding with him. He never came from a background where comfort was the default. He came from a background where persistence was a necessity. Eventually, education became the bridge. He reached the University of California, Berkeley, and that detail alone is enough to stop you for a second if you think about the distance involved. Berkeley is not just a school, it is a gate into a different level of expectation. It is a place where people arrive already trained to believe they belong there. For Alfredo, the achievement was not only academic, it was existential. He had crossed from a world that had been trying to define his limits into a world that demanded proof. And he gave it proof. He made the transition. He earned his place, not by pretending to be someone else, but by becoming more fully himself. That is the part of the story where a lot of people expect the movie to end. The underdog has made it to the university. The impossible has started to look possible, but the real-life version keeps going, and it gets harder. Berkeley was not the summit. It was one more steep section of the climb. From there, he made his way to Harvard Medical School, a place with its own gravity and its own traditions, a place that can feel almost unreal to someone who entered adulthood in the fields. Imagine what that means. Imagine crossing from the physical labor of harvest into the intellectual pressure of one of the world's most famous medical schools. It is not just a change in institution, it is a change in universe. Harvard did not erase where he came from. If anything, it sharpened the contrast. He was now entering a profession built on precision, hierarchy, and relentless standards. Medicine does not care where you started if you cannot perform. Neurosurgery cares even less. That field asks for a particular kind of discipline because the stakes are enormous. The brain is not a place for guesswork. It is not a place for casual confidence. It is a place where the difference between success and harm can be measured in millimeters. To enter that world after coming from a migrant labor background required more than ambition. It required the willingness to be a beginner again and again while never losing sight of the destination. After medical school, he trained in neurosurgery at UCSF, and that is where the story takes on its sharper edges. Neurosurgery is one of the most demanding specialties in medicine because it combines anatomy, physiology, judgment, technical skill, and emotional control under immense pressure. At UCSF, he entered a world where excellence is not a slogan but a daily requirement. Every operation, every decision, every tiny movement matters, and that environment shaped him into more than a doctor. It helped shape him into a surgeon scientist, someone who would not only operate on the brain but also ask what the disease was doing at a deeper biological level. That distinction matters because the brain is not just another organ, it is the place where identity lives. It is the center of memory, language, movement, sensation, personality, planning, and consciousness. When something goes wrong there, the effect is not just physical, it is personal. A tumor in the brain can change the way someone speaks, thinks, walks, sees, or recognizes the world. It can alter behavior, it can create weakness, headaches, seizures, nausea, confusion, or loss of balance. And because the brain is so densely organized, even a small lesion can have a large effect. This is why brain tumors are so feared. They do not just threaten survival, they threaten the systems that make life feel like itself. A tumor, at its simplest, is an abnormal growth. Some are benign, some are malignant. Some begin in the brain itself, while others travel there from different parts of the body. But regardless of the category, the basic challenge is the same. Something is occupying space where it should not be. In the brain, space is precious. There is no room to ignore a growing mass. There is no way to separate the disease from the organ without consequences. That is why the field of neuro-oncology is so difficult. It lives in a constant negotiation between disease removal and function preservation. There is almost never a perfect solution, there is only the best possible decision under the circumstances. That reality becomes even more intense when the diagnosis is glioblastoma. The name itself has become one of the most dreaded words in modern medicine. Glioblastoma is an aggressive form of brain cancer known for the way it infiltrates surrounding tissue instead of staying neatly contained. It does not behave like a simple ball that can be cut out and forgotten. It sends microscopic extensions into the brain around it. It hides. It adapts, it resists. Even when imaging makes the tumor look smaller after treatment, some cells may remain beyond the boundary of what the surgeon can safely remove or what the scan can fully show. That is what makes glioblastoma so devastating. It is not only a visible mass, it is a biological pattern of invasion. Patients are often treated with surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, but even with those combined efforts, the disease is notorious for returning. That recurrence is part of why the diagnosis carries so much fear. It teaches both patients and doctors a painful lesson. The visible disease is not always the whole disease. There may be more happening underneath the surface than anyone can see in the operating room or on a scan. This is where Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa's work becomes more than the story of a successful surgeon. It becomes the story of a scientist who understood that brain tumors must be attacked on multiple levels. He did not look at glioblastoma and see only an object to remove. He looked at it and asked what makes it survive. What allows it to grow back? Why do some cells persist after treatment? What is happening inside the tumor that makes standard approaches so limited? Those questions mattered because they pushed the field beyond the idea that surgery alone could solve everything. They pushed it toward a more honest and more sophisticated view of cancer biology. And that honesty is crucial. It is tempting, especially in a dramatic story, to frame a great surgeon as someone who can save everyone if only the disease is caught in time. But that is not how glioblastoma works. It is not a disease that bends easily to confidence. There is no truthful version of this story in which one extraordinary doctor simply conquers brain cancer alone. Progress in this field comes from teams, from decades of research, from pathology, imaging, radiation oncology, medical oncology, surgical technique, and molecular biology. Dr. Khan's importance is that he contributed to that larger effort. He helped move the conversation forward. He helped make the disease more understandable, and that is one of the most important steps toward better treatment. The surgery itself is where the tension becomes visible. To operate on a brain tumor is to live inside the phrase maximal safe resection. Those words sound technical, but the meaning is deeply human. Remove as much as you can without causing unacceptable harm. It sounds simple until you imagine the tumor sitting near speech centers, motor pathways, memory networks, or the regions that help a person interpret the world. A surgeon cannot just choose aggression for its own sake. The goal is not to win a dramatic contest against the tissue. The goal is to help the patient live with the best possible function after the operation. That is why some brain surgeries involve mapping techniques, advanced imaging, and in certain cases, awake craniotomies. The patient may be awake or partially awake while the surgeon tests functions in real time. The purpose is not spectacle, it is protection. The brain is being asked, in effect, to reveal where the lines of danger are before they are crossed. It is one of the most remarkable things in modern medicine, and it also shows why surgery has limits. Sometimes the right decision is to stop short of total removal because the next layer of tissue is too important to lose. That is not failure, it is judgment, it is the discipline of understanding that saving function is part of saving life. This is where a less careful story would try to turn every operation into a victory scene. But the real story is more restrained, and because of that, more powerful. Neurosurgery is often about preserving what cannot be replaced: a hand that can still move, a face that can still speak, a mind that can still connect, a life that can still return home. Those are the kinds of gains that matter. Not dramatic shortcuts, not fantasy cures, but carefully measured results that honor the patient's future. Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa built his career inside that reality. He learned to respect limits without being defeated by them. His scientific contribution grew out of the same mindset. He helped shape research into the idea that tumors may contain stem-like cells, a small population of cells that can behave differently from the bulk of the tumor, and may help explain recurrence and resistance. That idea changed how many researchers thought about brain cancer. Instead of asking only how to remove the mass, they had to ask how the disease regenerates itself. Instead of thinking only in terms of visible tissue, they had to think in terms of cell populations, molecular signals, and the hidden resilience of cancer biology. That shift matters because it changes the strategy. It suggests that surgery, while essential in many cases, is only one piece of a larger battle. It means the work must continue in the lab, in clinical trials, in pathology, in molecular research, and in the long, careful process of turning discoveries into better care. Dr. Q did not arrive with a magic answer. What he contributed was more durable than that. He contributed understanding. He helped connect the operating room to the laboratory. He helped show that the fight against glioblastoma requires both hands and ideas, both precision and theory, both action and analysis. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply with people who are not even in medicine. Because on some level, everyone understands the frustration of working hard on the visible problem while something hidden continues to shape the outcome. Everyone understands the feeling of discovering that a solution is more complicated than it first appeared. Alfredo's career is built around that truth. He did not just move from one social class to another. He learned how to solve problems in a way that respected complexity instead of pretending complexity did not exist. There is also the mentorship side of his life, which deserves just as much attention as the surgery and the science. A person like Dr. Q does not only influence patients, he influences the people who watch him work, the trainees who learn under him, the young doctors who see in his path a refusal of the usual limits. For students and residents, especially those from underrepresented or working class backgrounds, his presence has a special force. It says that the path into medicine does not belong to one accent, one passport, one family name, or one kind of childhood. It says that excellence can come from places the system often overlooks. That kind of mentorship matters because medicine reproduces itself through example. People learn not only from lectures but from what they see as possible. A person who once worked in the fields can become a mentor to future brain surgeons. A person who once had to fight for an education can later guide others through the same high-pressure environment. That does not happen by accident. It happens because he chose, again and again, to turn his own journey outward. He did not just climb. He reached back, and in doing so he widened the path for someone else. Still, the story should never become sentimental in a way that erases reality. Brain tumors remain dangerous. Glioblastoma remains one of the hardest diagnoses in medicine. Surgery remains limited by anatomy and biology. Research remains slow. Progress remains uneven. That is exactly why this story matters so much. It does not pretend the disease is conquered. It shows what disciplined hope looks like when the disease is still there. It shows that improvement can be meaningful even when it is not miraculous. It shows that a doctor can contribute to the fight without claiming to end it alone. That grounded hope is the right way to understand Dr. Q, not as a superhero, not as a legend floating above ordinary human limits, but as a man who made himself into a bridge between worlds, the world of migrant labor and the world of academic medicine, the world of the field and the world of the operating room, the world of underestimation and the world of earned authority. He crossed those boundaries without pretending they were not there, and because he crossed them honestly, the story has more power than a myth ever could. There is another reason his life keeps resonating, especially with younger doctors and students who are still trying to decide whether they belong in a room like that. Medicine can be intimidating even to people who grow up around it. The language is dense, the hierarchy is real, the training path is long, And when someone enters that world without the usual advantages, every mistake can feel heavier, every exam can feel more personal, every setback can feel like proof that they were never supposed to be there in the first place. Alfredo's trajectory cuts through that fear. It does not make the journey easier, but it makes the journey visible. It reminds people that belonging in medicine is not reserved for those who arrived with the right background. Sometimes belonging is built, one hard year at a time, until the room can no longer deny it. That is part of why his story works so well in long form narrative. It is not only about achievement, it is about the psychological architecture behind achievement. What does it take to keep studying when your day already began with labor? What does it take to sit in a lecture hall and not let embarrassment silence you? What does it take to absorb feedback in a field where every weakness is exposed quickly? What does it take to go from surviving to learning and from learning to leading? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the hidden machinery of the story. They are what make the climb feel real instead of polished. In the operating room, that same psychology shows up in a different form. A surgeon dealing with a brain tumor has to manage urgency without losing clarity. There is a patient on the table. There is a family waiting outside. There is tissue that may look simple from a distance and terrifying up close. There is the pressure to do as much as possible, but also the responsibility not to confuse ambition with judgment. The best surgeons learn to hear that tension instead of trying to erase it. They respect it. They let it guide them. That is what makes the words safe in maximal safe resection so important. It is not an apology, it is the whole point. The science behind that judgment keeps evolving, and Dr. Q has been part of the larger generation of physician scientists who helped connect surgical reality to laboratory insight. In a field like glioblastoma, every useful advance starts with a question that sounds deceptively simple. Why does the tumor return? Why do some cells survive treatment? Why do scans sometimes underestimate what is happening at the edge of the lesion? Why does the disease behave like a system rather than a static object? Those questions are not abstract. They shape how specimens are studied, how treatments are designed, how patients are followed, and how research programs are built. His contribution matters because he helped insist that the field keep asking them, and that insistence is one of the most human things about him. Great doctors are often described in technical terms, but the emotional dimension is just as important. To care about brain tumors for decades is to spend years living near fear, uncertainty, and disappointment without becoming numb to them. It is to tell difficult truths to patients and families while still carrying enough hope to keep showing up the next morning. It is to understand that progress may not look dramatic from one year to the next, yet still matter deeply over a generation. That kind of endurance is easy to admire from a distance and much harder to live. So when people talk about Dr. Q as an inspiration, the word should not mean something vague or decorative. It should mean a specific kind of instruction. It should mean that excellence can be built from the margins. It should mean that education can open a door no one in the family had ever crossed before. It should mean that scientific credibility can come from someone who once had blistered hands from field work. It should mean that the history of a person does not have to shrink when they enter a professional world. In his case, the history actually deepened the work. It made the medicine more grounded. It made the ambition more honest. When you think about it that way, the title becomes something richer than a simple statement. The Mexican farm worker who became Dr. Q is not just a caption about social mobility, it is a narrative about what happens when talent is not allowed to die in the wrong place. It is a narrative about persistence under pressure. It is a narrative about the long, often invisible work of becoming. And it is a reminder that the people we assume we understand based on where they start are often the people with the most to teach us about what human beings can endure. In the end, the story of Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa is not about a single miracle, and it is not about one man curing an entire field. It is about what medicine looks like when a person brings lived humility into a world that can sometimes become too proud of its own complexity. It is about how surgical skill and scientific curiosity can live in the same person. It is about how progress in brain cancer is made not by slogans but by slow accumulation of insight. And it is about how one life, begun in labor and scarcity, can end up expanding what other people believe is possible. That may be the quietest form of greatness. Not the kind that announces itself with loud claims, but the kind that changes the shape of the room simply by being there. A young man once stood in the fields and looked toward a future he could not yet see. Years later, he stood in the world of neurosurgery and helped push medicine forward, one careful question at a time. The distance between those two images is enormous, and yet they belong to the same life. That is what makes the story unforgettable. Not because it is easy to retell, but because it is hard to believe until you understand every step that made it true. What remains after a story like this is not a myth, but a standard. A reminder that medicine does not move forward in one dramatic leap. It moves because one generation teaches the next, because one surgeon trains the next resident, because one researcher asks a question that another later answers in a different way. Alfredo Quiñones-Hinojosa represents that kind of progress. His life is not only proof that a boundary can be crossed, it is proof that the crossing itself can become a path for other people. In the end, that may be the most durable legacy of all, not the illusion of perfect victory, but the harder and more honest gift of showing others how to keep going.